Buddhism entered Han China via the Silk Road, beginning in the 1st to 2nd century CE. The first documented translation efforts by Buddhist monks in China were in the 2nd century CE, possibly as a consequence of the expansion of the Buddhist Kushan Empire into the Chinese territory of the Tarim Basin. Direct contact between Central Asian and Chinese Buddhism continued throughout the 3rd to 7th century, well into Tang period. For the 4th century onward, with Faxian's pilgrimage to India, and later Xuanzang, Chinese pilgrims started to travel by themselves to northern India, the source of Buddhism, in order to get improved access to original scriptures. Much of the land route connecting northern India with China at the time was ruled by the Buddhist Kushan Empire, and later the Hephthalite Empire. CE.The. China was later reached by the Indian form of Tantra, esoteric Buddhism, in the 7th century. Tibetan Buddhism was likewise established as a branch of Vajrayana in the 8th century, but from about this time the Silk Road transmission of Buddhism began to decline with the Muslim conquest of Transoxiana, resulting in the Uyghur Khaganate by the 740s. By this time, Indian Buddhism itself was in decline, due to the resurgence of Hinduism on one hand and due to the Muslim expansion on the other. While Tang-era Chinese Buddhism was repressed in the 9th century, but not before in its turn giving rise to Korean and Japanese traditions. The transmission of Buddhism. First contacts Buddhism was brought to China via the Silk Road. Buddhist monks traveled with merchant caravans on the Silk Road to preach the new religion. The lucrative Chinese silk trade along this trade route began during the Han Dynasty with the establishment by Alexander the Great of a system of Hellenistic kingdoms and trade networks extending from the Mediterranean to modern Afghanistan and Tajikistan on the borders of China. The powerful Greco-Bactrian kingdoms in Afghanistan and the later Indo-Greek kingdoms practiced Greco-Buddhism and formed the first stop on the Silk Road, after China, for nearly 300 years. CE.The. The transmission of Buddhism to China via the Silk Road started in the 1st century CE with a semi-legendary account of an embassy sent to the West by the Chinese Emperor Ming. It may be assumed that travelers or pilgrims brought Buddhism along the Silk Roads, but whether this first occurred from the earliest period when those roads were open, California, 100 BC, must remain open to question. The earliest direct references to Buddhism concern the 1st century AD, but they include hagiographical elements and are not necessarily reliable or accurate. Extensive contacts, however, started in the 2nd century CE, probably as a consequence of the expansion of the Greco-Buddhist Kushan Empire into the Chinese territory of the Tarim Basin, with the missionary efforts of a great number of Central Asian Buddhist monks to Chinese lands. The first missionaries and translators of Buddhist scriptures into Chinese were either Parthian, Kushan, Sogdian or Kachyan. Central Asian missionaries in the middle of the 2nd century, the Kushan Empire under King Kanishka from its capital at Purushapura. India expanded into Central Asia and went beyond the regions of Kashgar, Khotan and Yarkand in the Tarim Basin, modern Xinjiang. As a consequence, cultural exchanges greatly increased, and Central Asian Buddhist missionaries became active shortly after in the Chinese capital cities of Luoyang and sometimes Nanjing, where they particularly distinguished themselves by the translation work. They promoted both Hinayana and Mahayana scriptures. 37 of these early translators of Buddhist texts are known, and Shigao, a Parthian prince who made the first known translations of Hinayana Buddhist texts into Chinese. Lokaksuma, a Kushan and the first to translate Mahayana scriptures into Chinese. Anshan, a Parthian merchant who became a monk in China in 181. Zhilao, a Kushan monk in the second generation of translators after Lokaksuma. Kang Mengxiang, the first translator from Kangzhou, Zhiqian, a Kushan monk whose grandfather had settled in China during 168 to 190. Zhi Yue, a Kushan monk who worked at Nanjing. Kang Sengui, born in Jiaozhi close to modern Hanoi in what was then the extreme south of the Chinese Empire, and a son of a Sogdian merchant. Tan Ti, a Parthian monk. Po Yen, a Kutchian prince. Dharmaraksa, a Kushan whose family had lived for generations at Dunhuang. And Faxian, a monk of Parthian origins. Posramitra, a Kutchian prince. Kumarajiva, a Kutchian monk and one of the most important translators. Photudeng, a Central Asian monk who became a counselor to the Chinese court. Bodhidharma, the founder of the Chan school of Buddhism, and the legendary originator of the physical training of the Shaolin monks that led to the creation of Shaolin Kung Fu. According to the earliest reference to him by Yang Shanxi, he was a monk of Central Asian origin whom Yang Shanxi met around 520 at Luoyang. Throughout Buddhist art, Bodhidharma is depicted as a rather ill-tempered, profusely bearded and wide-eyed barbarian. He is referred to as the blue-eyed barbarian in Chinese Chan texts. 5 monks from Gandhara who traveled in 485 CE to the country of Xuanzang, where they introduced Buddhism. Jainanagupta, a monk and translator from Gandhara. Iksananda, a monk and translator from Udayana, Gandhara. Prajna, a monk and translator from Kabul who educated the Japanese Kukai in Sanskrit texts. Early translations. The first documented translation of Buddhist scriptures into Chinese occurs in 148 CE with the arrival of the Parthian prince-turned-monk, Untitled. He worked to establish Buddhist temples in Luoyang and organized the translation of Buddhist scriptures into Chinese, testifying to the beginning of a wave of Central Asian Buddhist proselytism that was to last several centuries. Untitled translated Buddhist texts on basic doctrines, meditation and Abhidharma. Unshan, a Parthian layman who worked alongside Untitled, also translated an early Mahayana Buddhist text on the Bodhisattva path. Mahayana Buddhism was first widely propagated in China by the Kushan monk Lokaksuma, who came from the ancient Buddhist kingdom of Gandhara. Lokaksuma translated important Mahayana sutras such as the Astasata Shrika Prajnaparamita Sutra, as well as rare, early Mahayana sutras on topics such as samadhi and meditation on the Buddha Akshvya. These translations from Lokaksuma continue to give insight into the early period of Mahayana Buddhism. Chinese pilgrims to India. For the 4th century onward, Chinese pilgrims also started to travel on the Silk Road to India, the origin of Buddhism, by themselves in order to get improved access to the original scriptures. According to Chinese sources, the first Chinese to be ordained was Zhou Zixing, after he went to Central Asia in 260 to seek out Buddhism. It is only from the 4th century CE that Chinese Buddhist monks started to travel to India to discover Buddhism first-hand. Faxian's pilgrimage to India is said to have been the first significant one. He left along the Silk Road, stayed 6 years in India, and then returned by the sea route. Xuanzang and Haichou traveled from Korea to India. The most famous of the Chinese pilgrims is Xuanzang, whose large and precise translation work defines a new translation period, in contrast with older Central Asian works. He also left a detailed account of his travels in Central Asia and India. The legendary accounts of the holy priest Xuanzang were described in the famous novel Journey to the West, which envisaged trials of the journey with demons but with the help of various disciples. Merchants. During the 5th and 6th centuries CE, merchants played a large role in the spread of religion, in particular Buddhism. Merchants found the moral and ethical teachings of Buddhism to be an appealing alternative to previous religions. Chinese. As a result, merchants supported Buddhist monasteries along the Silk Roads, and in return the Buddhists gave the merchants somewhere to stay as they travel from city to city. As a result, merchants spread Buddhism to foreign encounters as they travel. Merchants also helped to establish diaspora within the communities they encountered, and over time the cultures became based on Buddhism. Because of this, these communities became centers of literacy and culture with well-organized marketplaces, lodging, and storage. The Silk Road transmission of Buddhism essentially ended around the 7th century with the rise of Islam in Central Asia. Buddhism in Central Asia began to decline in the 7th century in the course of the Muslim conquest of Transoxiana. A turning point was the Battle of Talis of 751. This development also resulted in the extinction of the local Tocharian Buddhist culture in the Tarim Basin during the 8th century. The Silk Road transmission between Eastern and Indian Buddhism thus came to an end in the 8th century. On one hand, because Islam in Central Asia repressed Buddhism along the Silk Road itself, but also because Buddhism in both India and China were in decline by the time. For the 9th century onward, therefore, the various schools of Buddhism which survived began to evolve independently of one another. The vigorous Chinese culture era progressively absorbed Buddhist teachings until a strongly Chinese particularism developed. In the Eastern Tarim Basin, Central Asian Buddhism survived into the later medieval period as the religion of the Uyghur Karakullu kingdom, and Buddhism became one of the religions in the Mongol Empire and the Chagatai Khanate, and via the Oirats eventually the religion of the Karmics, who settled at the Caspian in the 17th century. Otherwise, Central Asian Buddhism survived mostly in Tibet and in Mongolia. Artistic influences. Central Asian missionary efforts along the Silk Road were accompanied by a flux of artistic influences, visible in the development of Serindian art from the 2nd to the 11th century CE in the Tarim Basin, modern Xinjiang. Serindian art often derives from the Greco-Buddhist art of the Gandhara district of what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, combining Indian and Greek influences. Highly syncretized forms of this syncretism can also be found on the eastern portions of the Tarim Basin, such as in Dunhuang. Silk Road artistic influences can be found as far as Japan to this day. In architectural motifs are representations of Japanese gods. Buddhism in the Book of Later Han. The Book of the Later Han, compiled by Fan Yi, documented early Chinese Buddhism. This history records that around 65 CE, Buddhism was practiced in the courts of both Emperor Ming of Han at Luoyang and his half-brother, King Ying of Cheng. The Book of Han has given rise to discussions on the maritime or overland transmission of Buddhism, and the origins of Buddhism in India or China. The Book of Han. First, the Book of the Later Han biography of Liu Ying, the king of Chu, gives the oldest reference to Buddhism in Chinese historical literature. It says Ying was both deeply interested in Hu Wang Lao Daoism and observed fasting and performed sacrifices to the Buddha. Hu Wang Laozi is the deification of Laozi, and was associated with Fangxi, technician, magician, alchemist methods, and Zhan, transcendent, immortal techniques. To Liu Ying and the Chinese devotees at his court, the Buddhist ceremonies of fasting and sacrifices were probably no more than a variation of existing Daoist practices. This peculiar mixture of Buddhist and Taoist elements remains characteristic of Han Buddhism as a whole. In 65 CE, Emperor Ming decreed that anyone suspected of capital crimes would be given an opportunity for redemption, and King Ying sent 30 rolls of silk The biography quotes Ming's edict praising his younger brother. The king of Chu recites the subtle words of Hu Wang Lao and respectfully performs the gentle sacrifices to the Buddha. After 3 months of purification and fasting, he has made a solemn covenant with the spirits. What dislike or suspicion could there be that he must repent? Let redemption be sent back, in order thereby to contribute to the lavish entertainment of the Upasakas and Sramana. In 70 CE, King Ying was implicated in rebellion and sentenced to death, but Ming instead exiled him and his courtiers south to Danyang, where Ying committed suicide in 71 CE. The Buddhist community at Pensheng survived, and around 193 CE, the warlord Zhairong built a huge Buddhist temple, which could contain more than 3,000 people who all studied and read Buddhist scriptures. Second, Fan Ye's Book of Later Han quotes a current tradition that Emperor Ming prophetically dreamed about a golden man, Buddha, while the kingdom of Tianzhu section recorded his famous dream. The Annals of Emperor Ming history did not. Apocryphal texts give divergent accounts about the imperial envoys sent to India, the return with 2 Buddhist monks, Sanskrit sutras carried by white horses, and establishing the White Horse Temple. Maritime or overland transmission. Since the Book of Later Han present 2 accounts of how Buddhism entered Han China, generations of scholars have debated whether monks first arrived via the maritime or overland routes of the Silk Road. The maritime route hypothesis, favored by Liang Qichao and Paul Pelliot, proposed that Buddhism was originally introduced in southern China, the Yangtze River and Huai River region, where King Ying of Chu was worshipping Laozian Buddha c. 65 CE. The overland route hypothesis, favored by Tang Yongtong, proposed that Buddhism disseminated eastward through Yuezhi and was originally practiced in western China, at the Han capital Luoyang, where Emperor Ming established the White Horse Temple c. 68 CE. The historian Rong Xinjiang re-examined the overland and maritime hypotheses through a multidisciplinary review of recent discoveries and research, including the Gandharan Buddhist texts, and concluded, the view that Buddhism was transmitted to China by the sea route comparatively lacks convincing and supporting materials, and some arguments are not sufficiently rigorous. The most plausible theory is that Buddhism started from the greater Yuezhi of northwest India, and took the land roads to reach Han China. After entering into China, Buddhism blended with early Daoism and Chinese traditional esoteric arts, and its iconography received blind worship. Origins of Buddhism. Fan Ye's commentary noted that neither of the former Han histories, the records of the Grand Historian and Book of Han, described Buddhism originating in India. Zhang Qian noted only that this country is hot and humid. The people ride elephants into battle. Although Ban Yong explained that they revere the Buddha and neither kill nor fight, he has recording nothing about the excellent texts, virtuous law, and meritorious teachings and guidance. As for myself, here is what I have heard. This kingdom is even more flourishing than China. The seasons are in harmony. Saintly beings descend and congregate there. Great worthies arise there. Strange and extraordinary marvels occur such that human reason is suspended. By examining and exposing the emotions, one can reach beyond the highest heavens. In the Book of Later Han, the Kingdom of Tianzhu section of the Chronicle of the Western Regions summarizes the origins of Buddhism in China. After noting Tianzhu envoys coming by sea through Rinan and presenting tribute to Emperor He of Han and Emperor Wan of Han, it summarizes the first hard evidence about Prince Ying and official story about Emperor Ming. There is a current tradition that Emperor Ming dreamed that he saw a tall golden man, the top of whose head was glowing. He questioned his group of advisors and one of them said, "In the West there is a god called Buddha. His body is 16 ki high, and is the color of true gold." The emperor, to discover the true doctrine, sent an envoy to Tianju to inquire about the Buddha's doctrine, after which paintings and statues appeared in the Middle Kingdom. Then Ying, the king of Chu, began to believe in this practice, following which quite a few people in the Middle Kingdom began following this path. Later on, Emperor Wan devoted himself to sacred things and often made sacrifices to the Buddha and Laozi. People gradually began to accept and, later, they became numerous. Buddhism in apocryphal traditions. Despite secular Chinese histories dating the introduction of Buddhism in the 1st century, some apocryphal Buddhist texts and traditions claim earlier dates in the Qin dynasty, a former Han dynasty. Qin dynasty. One apocryphal story, first appearing in the Lidai San Baoji, concerns a group of Buddhist priests who supposedly arrived in 217 BCE at the capital of Qin Shihu Wang in Anyang. The monks, led by the Shramana Shilafang, presented sutras to the first emperor, who had them put in jail. But at night the prison was broken open by a golden man, 16 feet high, who released them. Moved by this miracle, the emperor bowed his head to the ground and excused himself. The Faluan Julan Buddhist Encyclopedia elaborates this legend, with Mauryan Emperor Ashoka the Great sending Shilafang to China. With the exception of Liang Qichao, most modern sinologists dismiss this Shilafang story. Some Western historians believe Emperor Ashoka sent Buddhist missionaries to China, citing the 13th Rock Edict that records missions to Greece, Sri Lanka and Nepal. Others disagree. As far as we can gather from the inscriptions, he was ignorant of the very existence of China. Han Dynasty. There is a Chinese tradition that in 02 BCE, a Yuezhi envoy to the court of Emperor Ai of Han transmitted one or more Buddhist sutras to a Chinese scholar. The earliest version derives from the lost Vilus, quoted in Pei Songzhi's commentary to the records of Three Kingdoms. The student at the Imperial Academy Jing Lu received from Yekan, the envoy of the king of the Great Yuezhi, oral instruction in Buddhist Sutra. Since Han histories do not mention Emperor Ai having contacts with the Yuezhi, scholars disagree whether this tradition deserves serious consideration or can be reliable material for historical research. The dream of Emperor Ming. Many apocryphal sources recount the pious legend of Emperor Ming dreaming about Buddha, sending envoys to Yuezhi, and the return with sacred texts and the first Buddhist missionaries, Kasyapa Matanga and Dharmaratna. They translated the sutra in 42 sections into Chinese, traditionally dated 67 CE but probably later than 100. The emperor built the White Horse Temple in their honor, and Chinese Buddhism began. All accounts of Emperor Ming's dream and Yuezhi embassy derive from the anonymous introduction to the Sutra of 42 chapters. For example, the Muzi Lifuolan says, "In olden days Emperor Ming saw in a dream a god whose body had the brilliance of the sun and who flew before his palace, and he rejoiced exceedingly at this. The next day he asked his officials, 'What god is this?' The scholar Fu Yi said, 'Your subject has heard it said that in India there is somebody who has attained the Tao and who is called Buddha. He flies in the air. His body had the brilliance of the sun. This must be that god.' Academics disagree over the historicity of Emperor Ming's dream. Tang Yongtong sees a possible nucleus of fact behind the tradition, and Henry Maspero rejects it as propagandistic fiction. Emperor Wu and the Golden Man, exemplifying how traditional accounts of Chinese Buddhism sometimes combined history and legend. The Book of Han records that in 121 BCE, Emperor Wu of Han sent General Huo Qubing to attack the Xiongnu. Huo defeated the people of Prince Zhutu and captured the Golden Man used by the king of Hsiutu to worship heaven. Zhutu's son was taken prisoner, but eventually became a favorite retainer of Emperor Wu and was granted the name Jin Midi, with his surname Jin Gold, supposedly referring to the Golden Man. The golden statue was later moved to the Yunyang Temple, near the royal summer palace Ganquan. The Ainu account of the Tales of the World claims this golden man was more than 10 feet high, and Emperor Wu of Han sacrificed to it in the Ganquan Palace, which is how Buddhism gradually spread into